The war with Spain is going to propel the United States onto the world stage as a world power. And the war actually developed out of a particular issue in Cuba. You see, Cuba was a Spanish colony for almost 400 years, and the people there wanted independence. The War of the Cuban Rebellion was a savage one, and people in the United States are going to be automatically sympathetic to the Cubans because they were seeking independence, just like the United States did. We're also going to be sympathetic for two other reasons. First is going to be economic. Americans had investments in Cuba, and war endangers investments. Now, this isn't the primary issue. The primary issue is the second thing. Is going to be a humanitarian problem because one of the ways that the Spanish are going to try to combat this rebellion is by concentrating huge amounts of people into small spaces. And on top of that, we're going to have unsanitary conditions. The result is going to be a humanitarian crisis where people are going to die due to the disease and unsanitary conditions. These humanitarian issues are also going to be whipped up in the press through a practice known as yellow journalism, most notably by two of the biggest newspaper owners, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Yellow journalism basically it takes a story and blows it out of proportion, right? It takes a kernel of truth and then it starts to exaggerate. Because you have to remember, what are newspapers supposed to do? What is a primary reason for a newspaper? It's the same primary reason for a news channel. It's not to deliver the news. It's to be sold. It's to be watched, right? So so imagine, for example, if I were to have, to write a newspaper and it had nothing but good news, meaning nothing bad happened. I don't report anything in terms of crime, accidents, tragedy. It's all a bunch about little old ladies crossing the street with no problem, people helping out those old ladies. Everybody that went to work one day, that day came home that night, right? That newspaper would fail immediately. Okay, now let's throw in some bad news. All right, let's throw in somebody, a car accident, somebody getting run over, murder, tragedy, accidents. What's going to happen? People are going to read it. People are going to watch it, right? You watch the news more often, I guarantee you. You watch the news more often when there's bad news. There's a reason why when you look at your local newscasts, it always starts with bad news because it draws you in and it makes you watch the entire program, right? Well, that's the same thing here. Yellow journalism is sensationalized news. It takes a kernel of truth and blows it out of proportion in order to sell newspapers, and people are going to read it. Now, when this whole humanitarian crisis is going to happen under Grover Cleveland's presidency. Now, Cleveland wasn't responsible for it, obviously. It's not even in his lands. But he did not want any part of it. When William McKinley becomes president of the United States, he doesn't want any part of this war either. Remember, McKinley is actually a Civil War veteran. He actually got injured at the Battle of Antietam. He holds back, and in 1897 put pressure on the Spanish to stop the fighting. He wanted them to work something out and stop it. But something happens in the early 1890s, in 1898, in early 1898. The first thing that's going to happen is going to be that Spain's minister to the United States, a man named Enrique Dupuy de Lome, wrote a letter to somebody, and somehow the Cuban revolutionaries get a hold of it, and they send it back to the United States where it gets printed. In it, the letter is going to criticize McKinley as a weak popularity hunter. He criticized the President of the United States for his reluctance to enter the war. So this letter basically was intercepted and published on the front page of William Randolph Hearst newspaper. In it, it says that President McKinley was, I quote, weak and embittered for the affections of his people, a would-be politician who leaves a door behind himself while at the same time trying to appease the jingos of his party, unquote. The term jingo here comes from a term used at the turn of the century to describe somebody who is intensely nationalistic, often militaristic. The DeLome letter is going to embarrass McKinley and brings the United States one more step closer to war. Well, DeLome is going to resign, but the damage is already done. The people who wanted war back in the United States were going to be encouraged by the DeLome letter.